Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to see you all virtually, or at least see your names here. This is the final webinar by the Center for Advanced Study project, Books Known Only by Title, Exploring the Gendered Structures of the First Millennium Imagined Library. So this project has been run very skillfully by Liv Ingeborg Lied and Mariana Bielencarzo. And it's been so much of a joy to be part of it from the beginning, and definitely bittersweet to see it coming to the end. We are so grateful to those of you who are attending and watching tonight, and many of you, we recognize your names from previous installations of these webinars, and so it's been wonderful to have you and to have all your thoughtful questions and your appreciations. I especially want to welcome the participants in the ATTR seminar on collections, archives, and libraries, which is running this week and has this as part of their program. We're sorry that we can't have Andrew for you here in person, but I know it'll be very much a treat to hear him speak. As always, the format is that Andrew will speak for a while, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask questions. For those, please use the Q&A. You can ask them in chat, but they often get lost there if people go into side discussions, so the Q&A is the safest place to put questions. And we will run until 7 o'clock, so we'll have an hour. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce Andrew Jacobs, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. He is the author of several books, including most recently Epiphanius of Cyprus, a cultural biography of late antiquity. And he is the editor of the Cambridge University Press series, Elements of Religion in Late Antiquity. Andrew, please take it away.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And this has been such an amazing series. And I've been in the audience many times, and it's just a pleasure. It would have been great to be there in person, but I guess this is the next best thing. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And please let me know if you can see that. Yes, great. So in the early 1970s, European and US archaeologists mounted a search for undiscovered ancient texts in the Dead Sea region, near where the famous scrolls had been found decades earlier. Their leader, brash archaeologist Sir Max Lonsdale, had a vague, almost supernatural intuition that a major discovery awaited him. Soon after their Israeli military escort dropped their team at base camp, however, they were ambushed by Bedouin guerrillas, and all but one member of their team was killed. British Semiticist Geoffrey Mallory survived by hiding in a cave. There, his trembling hand found a first-century scroll with faint words visible in Aramaic, Judas. After his rescue by the Israeli military, Mallory smuggled the scroll out of Israel and back home, translated the shocking first-person testimony of the man who betrayed Christ. Such is the plot of the 1972 novel Judas, published in the US as The Judas Gospel by Peter Van Greenaway. It's an early example of the genre I call gospel thrillers, in which a lost first-century gospel appears or is rumored to exist, whose contents could upend what we think we know about the Christian Bible and Christian origins. Among the various types of lost gospel novels, mysteries, historical fiction, comic romps, the thriller predominates, emerging out of the conspiratorial ethos of the Cold War era to package the assortment of fears and desires about the Bible swirling through US culture. Judas is among 30 or so novels that have appeared since the 1960s and keep appearing, written almost uniquely in English and published in the US. I've been studying them as a window into US culture, conspiracy, and the Bible. Earlier fictional accounts of biblical discovery hearkened to the era of the Bible hunters, framing the recovery of a lost Christian text as a tale of adventure on a late imperial world stage. In the 1960s, lost gospel fiction takes a conspiratorial turn. Now the lost gospel is being hidden or sought or even forged by shadowy forces operating across a fractured political landscape. The protagonists of the novels stumble upon the secret and find themselves in a race against time to find the truth that could, as so many of the novels tell us, change the world. These novels are, as far as I can tell, largely unaware of each other. Gospel thrillers is my term for these books that center on conspiracy and a fictional gospel. They don't reference each other, although since 2006 or so, marketing and reviews often connect them to the Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code is also a conspiratorial thriller centered on Christian origins and dips into the same well of fears and desires as gospel thrillers. Dan Brown, however, stopped short of imagining an entirely new gospel appearing in our day, relying instead on, let's say, creative readings of existing non-canonical texts to propel his conspiracies. Gospel thrillers go further. They invent gospels that have never existed except in the imagination of authors and readers. This willingness to imagine first century texts coming to light, to contemplate what a shocking new discovery might mean about the Bible, and always to remember that this new gospel is fiction, is key to the cultural work of these novels. I'm going to take us all on a quick tour of my project today, but let me state up front my larger point in studying them and in bringing them forward in a symposium about unruly books and knowledge in the ancient world. Gospel thrillers disclose, explore, and contain a range of fears and desires about the geopolitical, theopolitical, and personal instability of the Bible. That is, they reveal how the modern Bible, produced and authorized by professional Euro-American biblical studies, is a vulnerable Bible, unstable, unruly, and uncomfortably open to revision and alteration. By geopolitical instability, I refer to the way the Bible, as a totem of Western, white, Euro-American, generally Protestant identity, is necessarily reconstructed and revised out of material recovered from its site of origin, what we now call Israel and Palestine. Gospel thrillers focused on new Dead Sea Scrolls type lost gospels temper and recalibrate the troubling semi or non-whiteness and non-Christianness of the ancient and modern lands of biblical origins. Theopolitical instability highlights the theological malleability of earliest Christianity, most evident in gospel thrillers that conjure a heretical first century gospel challenging orthodox notions of Christian community. In these gospel thrillers, we see the double-edged desire for and fear of heretical Christian origins. On the one hand, they invent texts that promise liberation from the constraints of hidebound institutionalism. On the other hand, they imagine ancient sectarian groups freed from orthodox constraint, living a twisted form of Christian truth into the present day. It's no surprise that politics and theology play a role in biblical instability, but so too do personal identities and motivations, although these are rarely subject to critical analysis in biblical studies. Gospel thrillers, however, spend a great deal of time on the human nodes of biblical knowledge production: academics, native informants, and clergy who embody an esoteric past, but who also keep the truth hidden away in secret archives. Here, I'm going to focus on academic knowledge brokers who highlight the danger that comes from biblical exploration. I then conclude my tour of gospel thrillers by turning from fiction to fact. The geopolitical, the theopolitical, and the personal structure recent debates surrounding new biblical discoveries. I focus on one that has picked up steam again in recent years, the secret gospel of Mark, to link the fantasies of a fictional genre to the anxieties of a professional scholarly guild. Modern biblical studies has produced a New Testament that is always under revision and therefore vulnerable, an impossibly unstable book upon which white Protestant US truths are constructed. Fictional gospel thrillers confront but contain that biblical vulnerability. The real world Bible produced within biblical studies will always remain unruly. Geopolitics. The fine narrative with which I began from Van Greenaway's Judas amplifies key themes of the popular Dead Sea Scrolls discovery story. To recap that story, in 1947, so it goes, a young Bedouin, Muhammad the Wolf, threw a rock into a cave looking for his lost goat, and the ensuing breaking of a jar became the sound heard round the archaeological world. On first blush, this story seems a far cry from a British Semiticist huddled in a cave hiding from Bedouin attack. Yet if we turn our focus from the agents of discovery to the ideological subtext of the find, as Eva Morochek does in her astute studies of find narratives, we see in both cases a landscape that is at once generative and dangerous. The cave of discovery is a container, fixed in a biblical landscape frozen in time, offering up its secrets to the unsuspecting passerby, whether a wandering goatherd or cowering Semiticist. This generative wilderness may be slumbering, but it's not safe. It's a no man's land, rife with lawless violence. Muhammad the Wolf, according to early accounts, is no mere pastoral goatherd, but in fact part of a smuggling ring, eager to profit from his discovery. When Van Greenaway writes his fictional account, he makes the Bedouin who attack Lonsdale and his team members of the same Tamira tribe as Muhammad the Wolf. The presence of Israeli military in Judas, bookending the archaeological massacre, highlights the danger of this generative biblical desert. The Israeli military help gospel thrillers come to terms with the foreignness of the land from which new gospel truths emerge. Despite early US fantasies of the Zionist whitening of Palestine by Jewish immigration, by the 1960s and 1970s, this space was viewed as westernized, which is of course not the same as Western. Israeli westerliness is not racial or ethnic or religious, but technocratic, olive-skinned, dark-haired, hyper-skilled soldiers and scholars. In Judas, the Israeli soldiers who rescued Mallory are also so proficient in biblical antiquities that they transcribe and translate the newly found gospel before Mallory can smuggle it out of the country. In Larry Witham's The Negev Project, we meet Simone Rabin, who is, I quote, by every measure the soldier scholar so romanticized in his country. Rabin, who had also fought in the early days of Israeli independence, is clearly modeled on Yigael Yadin, the soldier, politician, and archaeologist famous, among other things, for excavating Masada and popularizing the site as an emblem of Israeli nationalist heroism. In gospel thrillers, the presence of Israeli military can safeguard the Western extraction of biblical truths, but the image of the Sabra soldier and scholar in search of his past, as Yadin's biographer calls him, could also disrupt this ideal of Christian biblical extraction. The past that Yadin and other Sabra soldier scholars were determined to recover at sites like Masada was a masculine, muscular past, culminating in the independent state of Israel, not a biblical past leading to Jesus and Christianity. Perhaps for this reason, gospel thrillers prefer their Sabra soldier scholars to be women. These women soldier scholars are not the main characters of the novels, but rather adjuncts and love interests to the non-Israeli male protagonists. In the Masada scroll, US professor Preston Lucas meets soldier scholar spy Lieutenant Sarah Arad. The woman in her late 20s, 30 at most, Preston guessed, was disconcertingly attractive, with high cheekbones, olive complexion, chocolate brown eyes, and raven hair pulled up beneath a military beret. In the Lost Testament, Australian Dead Sea Scrolls scholar Michael Farber is brought back to Israel by rumors of a testament of Jesus. There he meets up with his long-lost Israeli love, Judith Abramovich, whom he has not seen in 20 years. A successful archaeologist like Michael, Judith shows up to their reunion wearing the uniform of an Israeli army colonel, crisp and efficient. At one point, wandering alone through the ruins of Masada, praying for comfort, one image comes to Michael, an image from a simpler time, the sharply defined, dark-skinned Semitic beauty, Judith. These are not subtle images, but gospel thrillers are not a subtle genre. The least subtle feminine embodiment of the Sabra soldier scholar is Sabi Karaim in the 13th Apostle, whose given name is actually Sabra. Sabi is an Israeli translator working with the novel's protagonist, US cyber whiz Gil Pearson. Like Sarah and Judith, Sabi is ethnically sexualized, tall with dark straight hair to her shoulders and high full breasts that strained against her ivory silk blouse. She's also a former Israeli spy and trained soldier who ensures that Pearson can crack the code and decipher the Gospel of Micah. This parade of swarthy, smart, and deadly Israeli women fit into the thriller genre. They provide exotic color and love interests for the non-Israeli main characters. But they also allow these novels to domesticate their fictional biblical discoveries, gospels which, like these women, are colored by the fruitful and dangerous sands of Israel from which they emerge. These women embody for the readers the desirable otherness of the new biblical find, and by extension, that of the conventional Bible, which also once emerged from these hot sands. Gospel thrillers also confront contradictory Christian desires for and anxieties about a Jewish past and a Jewish savior. In some novels, the Jewish Jesus that we see in the New Gospel is bold and revolutionary. In Judas, we learn that Jesus preached political liberation from Rome, a message not incompatible with later Christian beliefs, but certainly more suited to the ethos of a masculine militarized Israel. In the Judas Testament, Jesus is even more alienated from Christianity. The Soviet professor who has uncovered the firebrand document in state-run archives explains, and I quote, "He is what we would today call a Jewish fundamentalist. The law of Moses," he says, "is to be obeyed above all things. Those who infringe it and those who desecrate God's holy temple, they must be driven from Israel or put to the sword." In the 13th Apostle, the Gospel of Micah reveals that Yeshua was a troublemaker and rabble-rouser, preaching revolution against Roman rule and against Jewish corruption. A preacher of revolution and liberation embedded in but expanding out from the Middle East, the Jewish Jesus finds a lively counterpart in novels featuring ex-Jewish, half-Jewish, and otherwise ambiguously Jewish protagonists. Dina Vanderlyn in the Dead Sea Cipher is the daughter of a Protestant pastor and scholar, but granddaughter on her mother's side of a learned rabbi. Michael Farber in the Lost Testament was raised Jewish, but during his studies in Israel became a fervent Catholic convert. In the Pontius Pilate papers, independently wealthy archaeologist and playboy J. Brian Marcus breezily describes himself as surgeon manqué, dilettante digger, wandering Irish-American Jew. The Judas Testament's protagonist, Jay Gould, is an Irish Semitic scholar with a Jewish father and a Catholic mother. All of these hybridized protagonists reflect and refract the uncertain ambiguity of a Jewish Jesus. The ambiguous Jewishness of Jesus in gospel thrillers renders theological the geopolitical ambiguity attached to a westernized but not quite Western Israel. This tension already permeates biblical studies and Christian theologies that attempt to take seriously the historical Jewishness of Jesus. These novels are not sites to resolve that tension, but rather to confront it, grapple with it, and then contain it safely in the fictional story of an improbable discovery. Theopolitics. If the fine narratives of Dead Sea Scrolls in fact and fiction give us geopolitical insight into the instability of a Christian Bible extracted from the Middle East, the fine narratives of heretical Gospels in fact and fiction hint at a different kind of theopolitical biblical instability. The most famous find, possibly a year or two before the Dead Sea Scrolls, took place in southern Egypt, when another Muhammad Ali, supposedly unearthed a large jar, which, when smashed open, revealed ancient codices filled with heretical Gnostic Gospels. This narrative, popularized since the 1970s, has been called into question, but again, I'm more interested in the ideology of the fine narrative, which is once more amplified in gospel thrillers. The Dead Sea Scrolls slumbered in the deserts where they were composed. The Nag Hammadi codices were distinctly mobile, wandering from site to site and drifting from one language into another until they came to rest in a jar buried in the sands under circumstances which we still cannot clearly explain. Heretical gospels and gospel thrillers are also mobile and displaced. In Gospel Truths, a primitive version of the Gospel of Thomas lies buried in a Carolingian crypt in the Cathedral of Chartres. In The Prophetess, the seventh scroll of Sabrina, a mystical revelation of universalism, is squirreled away in a convent in rural Vermont. In the Book of Q, Jesus' admonitions about individual spirituality and gender equality are concealed beneath a medieval fountain in the Bosnian town of Visegrad. In a winky reference to the Nag Hammadi finds, the Lucifer Gospel places Jesus' lost account of a faked crucifixion in the Little Egypt region of Illinois. The destabilizing theologies of heretical Gospels are marked by displacement. Heresy in antiquity was imagined as fearsome, a diabolical deviation in faith that manifested in immoral and perverse rituals and behaviors, madness and blasphemy, in the words of Irenaeus of Lyon. The modern era, particularly in popular US academic texts, has reimagined heresy as a powerful alternative, in the words of Elaine Pagels, suppressed by intolerant orthodoxy. Pagels wrote in the Gnostic Gospels that after a successful triumph of institutional orthodoxy, the concerns of Gnostic Christians survived only as a suppressed current, like a river driven underground. The subterranean river finally burst above ground with the circulation of the Nag Hammadi texts. Gospel thrillers plunge readers into this world in which secret truths of ancient heretical teachings have been suppressed for centuries. They can go further, of course, than modern scholars who must work with later texts or hypothetical lost sources. Gospel thrillers can imagine the recovery of a lost gospel from Jesus' own time that reveals an original Christianity at odds with institutional orthodoxy. Jesus' teachings as heresy. These novels dwell at length on the perpetrators of the suppression, often some secret order operating from the deepest corridors of the Vatican. They also grapple with the tension between an exciting text bursting with liberating truths and nefarious sects, animated by and even perverted by those secret truths. Heresy in the novels is a double-edged sword, madness and blasphemy on the one hand, a powerful alternative on the other. Gospel thrillers imagine lost gospels that counter institutional sterility, a lost teaching of Jesus that would free his followers from the shackles of patriarchal orthodoxy. Keepers of the Secret configures this possibility of liberation in perhaps the crudest and most striking way by introducing a more authentic Gospel of John uncovered in the walls of a house in Ephesus in the 1930s that introduces Lael as the true messianic child of Mary, a daughter who preached, performed miracles, and raised the dead through her adopted foster brother, Jesus. Keepers of the Secret doesn't introduce any specifically heretical teachings deriving from Lael, apart from some echoes of spiritual logia from the Gospel of Thomas. Rather, the fact that the Messiah was a woman is deemed sufficiently radical to overturn patriarchal orthodoxy. Gospel Truths takes readers on a circuitous journey through multiple lost gospels, including an Aramaic form of Q, to a version of the Gospel of Thomas that conveys Jesus' teachings of liberation. In fact, these original teachings are explicitly compared to modern liberation theology, described as the latest heresy and threat to Rome. In The Lost Tomb, archaeologists track the lost words of Jesus from Herculaneum to the tomb of Boudica under London, to a California monastery, to a secret crypt below the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Lost Gospel preaches spiritual liberation related to the later Pelagian heresy, thus the detour to Britain, which, according to the novel, prizes individual freedom over institutional bondage. There shall be no priests, there shall be no temples, Jesus preached, or, as an angry cardinal puts it, the heresy of those who would deny the sanctity of the ordained. Gospel thrillers not only fantasize about a heretical Jesus preaching liberation, they also catastrophize about the theological anarchy and immorality of ancient heresies surviving into our own day. In the Book of Q, a global network of Manichaeans has existed for centuries and hopes to recover their precious lost text, the Hagia Hodoporia, or Holy Journey. While the Manichaeans plot through secrecy and terrorism to take over the Roman Catholic Church, a US Jesuit finds the text and uncovers its true message: radical egalitarianism, individual rights and responsibility, full and embodied existence as opposed to Manichaean asceticism, and the leadership of women. When it's released for public consumption with a few key alterations, this heretical gospel heals institutional orthodoxy of its patriarchal sickness, while also putting the misguided Manichaean heretics to flight. The heretical gospel puts the lie to the heretical sect that hope to claim its radical authority. Other gospel thrillers, however, are less sanguine about the ability of heretical texts to defeat the machinations of heretical sects. In the Judas Conspiracy, a fuller version of the Gospel of Judas has serendipitously been discovered in a New Haven mansion of the late father of the dean of Yale Divinity School. On the eve of its unveiling to the world, the text is stolen and the dean's sister-in-law is murdered during the robbery. The culprits are the Sethian Brotherhood, a millennia-old Gnostic sect that has been involved in immoral atrocities throughout history. Through their assassin Gabriel, they're even plotting to blow up the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. on Thanksgiving Day. While we never see the full contents of this heretical text, we're led to believe it aligns with the immoral perversions of the Sethian Brotherhood. It contains warped versions of the Beatitudes, like, "Blessed are the merciless, for they shall see the truth," that Gabriel leaves as gruesome calling cards next to his victims. Their grand patriarch is a ludicrously effeminate and depraved wealthy Englishman who leads the Brotherhood ineptly and accidentally burns down his manor house along with the Gospel of Judas while dancing around in his ceremonial robes. The movement thrives on appeals to broken masculinity, evident in its initiation rituals and recruitment methods, as recalled by Gabriel, a former drug addict who finds comfort in the male spiritual elitism of the Brotherhood. According to this heretical gospel, Judas had twin sons. David went on to found the Sethian Brotherhood to preserve his father's memory and the anti-material teachings of the Gnostic Jesus. I'm going to pause. There are workers outside my house. Can you hear that noise or no?
No, you sound fine.
Fantastic. Judas had two sons. David went on to found the Sethian Brotherhood to preserve his father's memory and the anti-material teachings of the Gnostic Jesus, while Jesse became a Christian. Thus, the bona fides of the Sethian Brotherhood is as ancient and authentic as that of Orthodox Christianity, if not more so. The most disturbing portrayal of a secret Gnostic group appears in the Dead Sea Deception. This lost gospel is also a fuller version of the Gospel of Judas, recovered from an encoded medieval manuscript. Along with the fuller narrative, it also contains a community rule for Judas and his followers' descendants. We learn that a Gnostic Christian community follows this rule and has survived for centuries. They live lives of social isolation, literally underground, speaking Aramaic and worshiping according to the secret gospel's instructions. Only a select few go out into the daylight world. Elohim, messengers, are trained assassins who eliminate anyone who stumbled upon their existence. And Kelim are vessels, women chosen by Lot to go out and marry healthy men, bear 3 children, and then return with their invigorated offspring to live again among the Judas people. An expert in Gnosticism explains to a police officer tracking these assassins that this sect's moral perspective is shaped by their fundamentally conspiratorial worldview of a hidden truth existing behind everything. We see this radically different morality throughout the novel: brutal murders, a plane brought down, and a barely thwarted plot to poison the water supply to Mexico City and kill 20 million people. The Judas people are not only morally distinct from those outside their sect, they've become physically distinct, thus the need to diversify their gene pool. They're pale from living underground, they speak a dead language, they emerge into the light only to guard their secrets and fortify their community. More than once, they're described as aliens, a secret race. This idea that Gnostics are a distinct subset of humanity appears in ancient Gnostic texts, in which those in the know understand themselves to be a different generation of humans, destined for salvation while this tainted world falls away. Dead Sea deception takes this notion seriously, causing a text and sect that divide humanity utterly. The grim and perverse immorality of Gnostic sects and gospel thrillers stands in stark contrast to the liberatory promise of heretical texts in these same novels. Secretive and power-hungry, these modern-day heretical sects are ironic and monstrous amplifications of the rigid and patriarchal institutional orthodoxy that heretical texts are imagined to oppose. The novel's desire for liberation and fear of the monstrous unknown are complementary, as we see so often in considerations of ancient heresy. Gospel thrillers can hold these tensile responses to religious freedom together without resolution, contained neatly within the covers of the fiction. The personal. Unlike modern biblical criticism, which has typically tended to scientize and depersonalize editorial revision of the Christian Bible, gospel thrillers explore the personal motivations of those characters who seek to find, hide, or distort the gospel truth. Protagonists frequently consult with experts, knowledge brokers, to understand the truth of the new gospel discovery. Among the various kinds of experts, native guides, cloistered monks, Vatican archivists, I focus here on academics, characters through whom we particularly see how unstable the production of biblical knowledge really is. Gospel thrillers are deeply ambivalent about the reliability of academic biblical experts. In the very first gospel thriller, the Q document, the specialized knowledge of academics is already a double-edged sword. The arcane knowledge deployed by historian George Cooper to unmask a biblical forgery is the same arcane knowledge of the Jewish scholar coerced by Nazis decades earlier into producing that forgery. In the book of Q, the same expertise that allows Italian scholar Cecilia Angeli to help US Jesuit Ian Pierce find the Hagia Sophia also allows her to alter that gospel, to remove information that might work against the liberalization of the church. In conspiratorial thrillers, a genre defined by the dangers of hidden truth, scholars' rarefied expertise makes them key but suspect brokers of biblical knowledge. Many of the academics we meet are sources of information for non-academic protagonists. This relegation of academics to the margins has a practical aspect, as it allows authors to naturalize otherwise clunky biblical studies exposition. It also allows the novels to express ambivalence about these strange characters. In the Word, PR agent Steve Randall must consult with academics so he can promote a new Bible translation containing Q, here a Gospel of James. He meets with the head of the project, Dr. Bernard Jeffries, barrel-chested with shaggy white hair, a small head with rheumy eyes, pinkish nose with large pores, an untidy mustache, wrinkled face, striped bow tie, dangling pince-nez, and a blue suit in need of a pressing. Jeffries, who is the best in his field, proceeds for almost a dozen pages to explain the highs and lows of biblical archaeology for the past century with unceasing verve. Soon afterward, Randall meets Dr. Florian Knight, described to him as one of those precocious and eccentric English geniuses, kind of a Buster Brown haircut, deep-set eyes, nose like the beak of an eagle, pushed-out lower lip, big ears, long, thin hands, high-pitched voice, high-strung manner, nervous, but absolutely a marvel on New Testament languages and scholarship. The nervous manner and mastery of knowledge seem to go together naturally, as if full-time occupation with the abstruse workings of ancient Greek grammar was still okay with the sound? All right. The nervous manner and mastery of knowledge seem to go together naturally, as if full-time occupation with the abstruse workings of ancient Greek grammar induced psychological abnormality. Gospel thrillers portray academics as odd, alienated from normal US virile manhood by their preoccupation with ancient languages and texts. In some cases, this alienation leads academic characters to suppress the biblical truth. The unpleasant and sexually frustrated Semiticist Mallory in Judas is willing to hide his newly found gospel in exchange for a payout from the Vatican. He's eventually eliminated by the more sinister and masculine Vatican forces he tried to extort. The paleographer Victor Landholtz in the Pontius Pilate papers is a war hero, a Nazi-fighting Zionist whose keen sense of anti-Semitic injustice led him to counterfeit evidence exculpating the Jews for the death of Christ. While perhaps more upright and manly than Mallory, Landholtz nonetheless ends up murdered by the fanatical Catholic patron who had sponsored his archaeological explorations. That both Mallory and Landholtz end up dead suggests that while academics may at times want to tamper with the biblical truth through suppression or forgery, they'll quickly find themselves out of their depth. Academics do on occasion appear as protagonists in gospel thrillers, but usually only once they've been displaced from the stultifying quarters of academia. Hooper in the Q document is in self-imposed exile from his academic post in the US, as is Declan Stewart, the tragedy-struck ex-archaeologist surfer living off the grid in G.M. Lawrence's Q Awakening. Braverman Bravo Shaw is lured away from the study of medieval religions and cryptography into private industry before taking up his true calling as one of the elite members of the secretive Order of the Gnostic Observantines. J. Marcus in the Pontius Pilate papers and Jack Howard in The Lost Tomb are both independently wealthy archaeologists. When gospel thrillers do have academic protagonists, they prefer them to be archaeological rather than textual, tanned, fit, and resourceful, unlike the sloppy Bernard Jeffries or the wan and weedy Florian Knight, rendered pale and impotent by superfluous book knowledge. Part of this preference is a long tradition of the archaeological adventurer, the Indiana Jones type who combines technical expertise with inventiveness. Nick Hampton in the Negev Project is a US archaeologist in Israel with a reputation for independence, whose first book on Bible scholarship had cut him loose from the establishment. Farber in The Lost Testament has a reputation as one of the world's most original and audacious biblical scholars. In The Prophetess, Catherine Alexander is a feminist archaeologist searching for evidence of Moses' sister Miriam when she stumbles upon a first-century gospel written by a woman. The archaeologist in the field embodies the independent spirit of the truth seeker, free from the constraints of hidebound institutions. There's something inherently suspicious about textual knowledge, the source of new truths, but also the instrument of conspiracies to cover up the truth. Academic characters also illuminate the dangers of biblical knowledge. I began with the violent deaths of Sir Max Lonsdale and his team in Judas, and the novels portray academics killed by package bombs, blown up by car bombs, pushed downstairs, and chased into traffic. In the Judas conspiracy, the violence of the Sethian assassin expands outward from New Haven to the meeting of the American Academy of Religion in New York. There, a scholar delivering a paper on the inferiority of the Gospel of Judas is killed while delivering his paper, and another scholar, scheduled to speak on the superiority of orthodoxy, narrowly misses death by poisoned chocolate strawberries. The grim humor of the situation, a Gnostic assassin on the loose at an international conference of religious studies scholars, derives from narrative exaggeration of a deadly serious point. New biblical knowledge is dangerous, and to assist in brokering that knowledge invites peril. The academic characters in gospel thrillers have a unique relationship to that knowledge, the ability to authenticate, disseminate, or suppress the new and dangerous biblical truth. Some, lackluster in their manly fortitude, do little more than provide handy exposition. Some more stalwart among those characters bravely face that danger. The more pusillanimous try to profit from it, and the more hapless fall prey to it. Finally, let's consider together what happens when these geopolitical, theopolitical, and personal instabilities leave the pages of the fictional genre and structure real-world controversies about biblical knowledge and discovery. Modern biblical criticism requires that the text of the Bible, and therefore its ultimate meaning, be open to revision due to new critical approaches and new textual discoveries, in a process that is theoretically without end. Gospel thrillers imagine this process of revision under threat from shadowy conspirators who suppress the truth or circulate forgeries. The Guild of Biblical Studies is also concerned about the vulnerability of the Bible. New biblical discoveries can therefore become explosive affairs. Morton Smith first made headlines with his New Gospel of Mark in 1960, when he presented the text he found at Marsaba Monastery outside of Jerusalem to a special session of the Society of Biblical Literature in New York. In 2007, the Secret Gospel of Mark made headlines again, this time as a result of renewed accusations that Smith had in fact forged the sensational find. The revived controversy has continued in print and at conferences 60 years after the text was revealed and 30 years after Smith's death. We can touch fairly briefly on the geopolitical context of Smith's find. Smith had first visited the monastery of Marsaba in 1941 as a visiting student from Harvard Divinity School. While there, he developed a friendly relationship with the local monastic leaders. World War II prevented Smith from returning home, and so while in Jerusalem, he completed a PhD at Hebrew University, as one does. In the late 1940s, upon his return to the States, he served as an Episcopalian priest before returning to Harvard to earn his PhD. In 1958, he went back to Marsaba to catalog their small monastic library. According to the popular account that he published in 1973 alongside his more scholarly tome, he had developed an interest in manuscript hunting. His hunt was successful, as he returned with photographs, but no manuscript, of an 18th century transcription and a 17th century book of a 2nd century letter by Clement of Alexandria containing 2 citations of a possibly 1st century mystical or secret version of the Gospel of Mark. Smith's account of the find harkens back, perhaps deliberately, to the era of Bible hunters like Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. Nonetheless, the story also paints the Holy Land of biblical discovery as both generative and dangerous. Smith returns to explore a fertile manuscripted landscape in which he had experienced the geopolitical turmoil of global war and the early days of the establishment of a new Jewish state. The theopolitical responses to the secret Gospel of Mark are more complex, but also fall predictably within the range of fears and desires we see for heretical Gospels and Gospel thrillers. While Smith's own arguments were centered on esoteric ritual activity in the Jesus movement, some scholars dismissed the find as simply evidence for the florid heretical environment of late 2nd century Alexandria. Clement was a notorious collector of strange tales and traditions, one reviewer noted. Other scholars in the 80s and 90s pushed Smith's Gospel further into the past, positing that secret Mark was in fact earlier than canonical Mark. The received text was a biblical cover-up of a more interesting and less orthodox preaching of Jesus circulating not long after his ministry. The personal angle on this find was slow to bubble up during Smith's lifetime. One review circumspectly suggested that the text was a forgery, but insisted, disingenuously as it turns out, that no accusation against Smith was intended. After Smith died in 1991, his estranged former student Jacob Neusner, who had provided a blurb for one of the 1973 books, began repeatedly accusing Smith of forging his gospel fragments to portray Jesus as a, quote, homosexual magician. Once Neusner lit the fuse, the Academy exploded with proof of Smith's forgery. It didn't help, of course, that as Neusner's diatribe made clear, Smith behaved in distinctly unpleasant ways in his professional life, and so made a believable villain for many in this biblical drama. Additional motives continued to be adduced, particularly since 2005, when several books on the secret Gospel of Mark began to appear. 3 related motives have coalesced around Smith. Some have accused Smith of acting out of professional ambition or jealousy, as the 1950s discovery took place at a critical juncture in Smith's academic career. Others point to his brief career as a Christian minister, which ended before he re-entered the Academy. Perhaps some posited he broke with the conservative religion of his upbringing and early career and wanted either to strike a blow against conservative Christianity or, more generously, to provide a vision of Christ centered on personal intimacy rather than stern remoteness. Finally, almost all recent accusations against Smith explicitly or implicitly find motive in Smith's own sexuality. Smith was subject to homophobic rumors during his lifetime. When Quentin Quesnel traveled to Jerusalem in 1983 to inspect the book containing the secret gospel, he had a meeting with Hebrew University professor David Flusser, during which the two of them wondered about Smith's homosexuality and whether it might have prompted his forgery. In more recent arguments for forgery, it seems taken for granted that a gay scholar would want to circulate a gay Jesus, either as revenge for his experiences of religious homophobia or in a sincere theological interest in liberation. With the certainty of Smith's motives in place, the actual proof of forgery seems almost incidental, but the longer the debate continues, the more creative the quest for such proof becomes. A proto-gospel thriller has even been adduced as evidence, the 1940 Canadian evangelical novel, The Mystery of Mar Saba, which several scholars now claim must have inspired Smith's forgery at the same site. It's no surprise that the prototype of gospel thrillers should make an appearance in the seemingly endless debate over a real-life story of a secret, shocking gospel. The story that biblical studies specialists keep telling about Morton Smith and his secret gospel reenacts the same theological, geopolitical, and personal anxieties that we see in the novels. Alexis Waller has read the debate on secret Mark as part of an affective history that illuminates broader issues in the historical approach to the Bible that predominates in biblical studies. Waller writes, I have a long quote here, "The exaggerated response to Smith's so-called homosexual designs in the Christian past might be felt, however, as speaking symptomatically to a kind of panic reverberating across the field. They point not only to anxiety about some scholarship touching the historical Jesus in an inappropriate way, but also to the anxiety of New Testament scholars generally feel about their own desires to make contact with the past. People on both sides of the argument seem to hold out hope that stabilizing the reputation of secret Mark as definitively forged or authentic will shut down uncomfortable uncertainties and perhaps alleviate anxiety about their own theological, imaginative, perverse relations with the past." As Waller suggests, no amount of rational argument or proof texting, no compilation of clues and evidence will shut down these uncertainties because they are endemic to what I'm calling the vulnerability of the modern Bible, produced and circulated by biblical studies. Here we see the value and perhaps even the genius of gospel thrillers and some small explanation for why this quirky genre has persisted for almost 60 years. Gospel thrillers offer a finite space to explore the fears and desires of the vulnerable Bible, made palatable by the fictionality of a new discovery. If the real world of biblical studies offers no consolation, leaving the Bible open, vulnerable, and unruly, the containments of fiction can act as a temporary balm to soothe the anxiety that New Testament scholars and their public audiences feel about their own desires to make contact with the past. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hopefully some questions and discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was incredibly interesting and just so much rich material that I almost don't know where to start. But everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A and we will convey them onward. In the meantime, to get started, if I may ask a question myself, I was really struck by when you were talking about the women in these books and the idea that they are somehow embodiments of or parallels to the texts themselves. And so I was wondering, first of all, just are they ever kind of overtly juxtaposed? Like, is this a conscious theme, do you think, or is it more of an underlying current? But then also, in what ways do these desires both kind of manifest the male Western white desire for control over the unruly, for being able to take these heretical texts, these strong women, and control them and put them under the rule of someone more stable?
So I wouldn't say necessarily that they're about controlling these women. I think one of the reasons precisely that so many of these novels, and I was sort of surprised when I realized this, have them be the sort of Israeli technocratic soldier scholars was to create a kind of benevolent partnership. So in the same way that we can imagine in kind of Bible hunter eras, like people like Tischendorf or Gibson Lewis, when they went, there was this idea that these manuscripts sort of slumbering, waiting to be awakened by the discoverer. Here, it's more that the land is cooperating by offering up in a kind of partnership. And therefore it sort of ameliorates what would otherwise be a novel sort of obvious non-whiteness, non-Westernness, not only of the gospel thrillers, but really of the Bible itself.
Thank you. So we have a short but very excellent question by Michael Jacobs. Do Jewish Israelis always appear as good guys, and are Arabs always bad guys?
It depends, and Michael Jacobs is in fact my brother, so hello. And it depends. So we're looking at a genre that spans 60 years, and so what happens is the geopolitical shape and presence of Israel shifts over that time. So in some novels, for instance, The Lost Testament, where we have this sort of ex-Jewish scholar returning to Israel to try to find this lost testament of Jesus, his opponents are, on the one hand, sort of evangelical Christians also looking for this gospel, but also a violent, hyper-Zionist politician terrorist in Israel. So sometimes Israel itself is split as a cooperative location and a non-cooperative location. And then we do get, as you get into the 80s and 90s, and particularly since the global war on terror, a more a clearer idea that if there's going to be a kind of global conspiracy to suppress the Bible, surely Muslims will be involved somehow. Although not as often as you might think. And in one weird novel, Mullah, I forgot his name, in Afghanistan, actually is a sort of weird good guy in the margins. He ends up in possession of this gospel and keeps it from other sort of bad Christians from getting a hold of it. So it's never quite that straightforward, but I will say that certainly the global context for the politics of Israel shifts over this time, and the novels kind of ride that shift as well.
Thank you.
So I have a question here from Jenny Knost, visiting in Oslo. What is your view of the relationship between the fiction in gospel thrillers and the fiction ? In the case of Morton Smith, 2 cases of imagined documents?
View of the relationship in the fiction and the, so I don't know that it's a conscious parallel. Certainly what happened beginning in 2001 when Philip Jenkins discovered the mystery of Marsaba, this novel, he was the first one to say, aha, that's where Morton Smith got the idea. And it's impossible to think that otherwise, how could he have said he found this gospel at the same place where this what ends up in the novel, spoiler, forgery gospel is found in the novel, he must have also forged it. There's lots of arguments against this. It becomes the kind of thing where once you've decided that Morton Smith has forged this, everything looks like evidence. And I think that's kind of the point. I think one of the things that rarely happens in biblical studies professionally, except in the case of these explosive discoveries, is the personal motives of biblical translators and interpreters are subject to critical scrutiny, not just kind of ad hominem scrutiny. So what a case like Morton Smith does in other instances, not only of accusations of forgery, but even something like the Gospel of Judas, which we all agree is true, and yet when it appeared in 2007 and following, the motives of translators and interpreters became somehow key to how this gospel developed in the public imagination. So it's these sorts of discoveries that allow this sort of crack in what is usually not part of the discourse of biblical studies, that is the personal motivations of the people involved in giving the public its official, authentic Bible. So I'm not arguing that these novels have consciously structured debates around Morton Smith, but I do see when we look at these controversies with Morton Smith, the Gospel of Judas, Jesus's wife, whatever is going to be discovered in 2 years from now, the same things come into play. The same sort of anxieties and fears and hopes come into play. With Morton Smith, it's been fascinating that this will not go away. A new book is coming out, I think, in a year or two by some scholars in Texas. It's going to revisit the whole thing. And I guarantee it will not end the debate, because that's not what the public wants. The public wants this to be a site to explore, particularly in Smith's case, the personal motivations involved in producing a Bible. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
Do you want me to take the next one, Esther?
Yeah, go for it.
Yep. So there's a question from Abigail Emerson. Do you get a sense from these novels, or your research about them, of the readers consuming them? Has that changed at all over the decades?
That's a great question. And at one point in my research, I thought it would be great to sort of figure out who's reading these. I think it's difficult to get a handle on. They appear in lots of different publication venues. And over time, I think the thriller market's become so saturated that it's really hard for any of these to break through. In early days, some of these were bestsellers. I mean, The Word in 1972 was like the #3 bestseller in the United States for the year 1972 or 73. And Robert Ludlum wrote one. I mean, this was basically the people who were consuming thrillers generally as their staple were consuming these. So if that's the case, I would assume readership is primarily male, primarily middle class, but I don't have access to that kind of data. Sometimes we can see it from reviews, particularly now because there's things like Goodreads and Amazon, which is how a lot of people hear about books and how a lot of people comment on books. So we can see that readership tends to be, from what I can tell, your basic thriller readership, but also people who have this interest in the Bible. The same people who made the Da Vinci Code a bestseller were interested in the Bible precisely as an object of conspiracy, right? What if the Bible is trying to get one over on us? How would the truth about the Bible be discovered? Who's suppressing the truth? Who's finding the truth? And the Bible as an object of conspiracy has been a topic of interest in US reading publics for decades. So I can't give a definitive answer, but I think those who are generally reading it, that's why they're reading it.
Great. Thank you. Liv, do you want to read the next question, or shall I?
Please go ahead if you want to.
Okay, from Chris Frilingos, we have the question, thanks, Andrew. A question about conspiracy. QAnon conspiracy theory makes me wistful for the generally benign nuttiness of gospel thrillers, but clearly both kinds are dangerous. Do you see any connection between the gospel thriller genre and current conspiracy fever?
I would not say direct connection. And I've done a lot of reading on conspiracy for this project, which has been both illuminating and horrifying, and especially to do this in this sort of age of QAnon. But I would say what's fascinating about QAnon as a conspiracy is that it is actually not structurally very different from other sorts of conspiracies, sort of big conspiracies that have percolated through the US from the Cold War on, in the sense that QAnon, if people don't know, it's based on this idea that there is, Q is a figure within the government who has secret knowledge of plans by the former president and others within the margins of the government to overturn a global pedophile conspiracy. So on the one hand, they're working against the deep state, which is the bad guys in the government, but they're themselves good guys in the government. And this is how these conspiracies often work, is that their bad guys have infiltrated the thing that's also going to save, that the good guys are going to save. So the government as both site of the perpetration of the conspiracy, but also the government as a site of revelation of the conspiracy and savior in the conspiracy. I would say structurally that is also the role of the Bible in these novels and in US culture. It is both the object of conspiracy, that is, people are trying to get one over on the Bible or use the Bible in particular ways to nefarious political ends or nefarious social ends. But the Bible can also be the source of salvation. It can be the thing that saves people and that redeems people and the truth that will set people free. And in gospel thrillers, these lost gospels do both of that, right? There's sometimes forgeries, but there's sometimes true discoveries. And this is how the conspiracy works. So that's all to say, no, not a direct connection between QAnon. I have not seen QAnon appear in any of these novels yet, but there's not really time. I guess maybe next year they'll show up. But generally, the US has been a conspiratorial polity for most of its history. The particular shape of that conspiracy since the Cold War and after the Cold War has definitively shaped the way gospel thrillers imagine the Bible as this object and subject of conspiracy.
Thank you. So we have a question from Megan Nutzman. Great talk. As a follow-up to the question about readership, what have you learned about the novelists who are writing these gospel thrillers? Do you know anything about how they decided to write these books?
I do know more about them, although interestingly, some of them are also writing under pseudonyms, which I think people who write thrillers often do. So a lot of the novels you saw, those are not the people's real names, but they run the gamut. The most I have information about is actually the most popular I mentioned before, The Word by Irving Wallace. And because I had the strange opportunity to go through his archives, which are housed in Claremont, California, where I used to work and teach. So I actually was able to look through every thought this man had that he saved on how he came up with these ideas. I think certainly since 2003, when Da Vinci Code, the book came out, in 2006, when the film came out, that motive, that the idea that biblical antiquities would be the subject of global conspiracy is very popular and people run with it. Before that, there's a mix of motives. I think some people are genuinely working through ideas about the Bible, right? Which is the Christian Bible. Like, we don't have like Moses thrillers, right? There's no Torah thrillers, it's gospel thrillers. When these people are talking about the Bible, it's the Christian Bible. Real anxieties about the Bible as a source of authority in US culture. And therefore, it makes sense for a lot of these authors to think through those. Some of them, very few of them have any actual previous knowledge or expertise about the Bible, and a lot of them are writing series. So a lot of them are sort of 5, 10, 12 book series, or the most recent one, Daniel Silva's The Order, it's like the 20th book in the series, where these various protagonists who tend to be ex-cops or spies or people who otherwise are involved in danger, they stumble upon various conspiracies, one of which in the series, or multiple of which, will be around the Bible. A lost gospel, sometimes it's actually lost evidence for Jesus, material evidence, and so on. So they run the gamut. There are also some evangelical novels, which I don't really talk about, that come out of evangelical presses, which are much more interested in using this scenario to bolster the existing Bible as authentic and true, rather than to imagine the Bible being destabilized by a new discovery. But since I'm not, that would involve another kind of research trajectory. I've sort of bracketed those. There's maybe only 4 or 5 of those that I can pick up. But yes, so I do have a website, which I was trying to pull up to get the, oh, here we go. I'm gonna put a link in the chat, which I'm trying to put together a companion website to this, which has all this kind of information. So this actually has information about all the novels, including links to information about their authors, reviews when they exist, and so on. So that's a place you can find answers to some of those questions.
So I have a question for you as well. I actually have 2 two different ones. Can I pose both? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the first one has to do with, you're talking about here, about these novels as a US phenomenon, and they certainly are. Can you reflect a little bit about that with us? Because I'm thinking, well, at least in Norway, we do have a similar phenomenon. We have Tom Egeland, who's written, like, I think he's using every aspect of the early Christian narrative, and he's like pouring out books about it. For instance, a book called Codex, and then you can just imagine what that is. So I was wondering if you could say something about what aspects of this is has to do, or like particularly with the US. So I would love to hear something about that.
Yeah.
And yes,
oh,
go ahead.
Why don't you ask both and I'll write it down.
Okay, and the other one has to do with the relationship, or it has to do with the representations of academics, because I'm thinking that there's a representation of academics in these fictitious books, and then there's a representation of academics in public media, and then there is a representation of academics that are available for academics to move into, and which they do. And I would love to hear you think about the relationship between these two. I'm thinking, for instance, about the way that Ariel Sabar describes Karen King in his Atlantic piece. That's just like an example of how similar this is. And I'm also thinking then about like a character like James Charlesworth and how he is like using these narratives potentially to like make a role for himself. And then I'm not suggesting that he's the only one, he just came to mind. So please.
Yeah. So in the first question, of the 30 or so novels I'm looking at, I would say maybe a third were actually not written by US authors. They were written by Australian, English, Irish in one case. I am looking at them as a US phenomenon because A, they're all published in the US. So no matter where they were originally published, they appear in the US and are mass market in the US as part of the US phenomenon. It also makes sense to me to think about them in a US context. Some of the very specific tropes that they use in terms of the portrayal of the protagonists, in terms of the kinds of conspirators. So for instance, the anti-Catholicism that's pretty pervasive in these novels, where Roman Catholicism stands for a particular notion of institutional religion that is global and conspiratorial, which makes a lot of sense in a US anti-Catholic context and can make sense in other contexts, but also makes sense in that context. So the pervasiveness of Nazis, which again, everyone fought Nazis, but Nazis as this paradigmatic, as in Indiana Jones, anti-US sort of caricature. So yeah, only one of them was actually not originally written in English that I'm looking at. It was written in Portuguese, but also immediately translated into English and published in the US, where it sold many more copies than it did probably in Portugal, where the author is from. So I don't know the author you talked about, but I'm gonna go look them up as soon as we're done with this. I would be fascinated to hear what other people think about these as fitting into other national contexts. I think it's also in the same way when we talk about mass media, the US market is so significant for any production of mass media, novels, film, television, that, and this is just me speaking off the top of my head, I'm not a mass media critic, but it has such a power to shape generic formulations that I feel fairly comfortable talking about this as speaking to US fears and desires, because it certainly is, even when the authors themselves or the texts are not originating in those spaces, they come and play into those US cultural fears and desires. So that's my answer. But I'd be thrilled for someone to say, but in this non-Western context or non-US context, it plays out differently or plays out the same. I think that would be fascinating to think about too. Academics and the gospel thrillers, yeah, certainly the way academics are portrayed is based partly on stereotypes about academics as these holders of knowledge who are probably not trustworthy for various reasons. There's something just suspicious about knowledge acquisition in any these are conspiratorial novels. So the acquisition of knowledge is by definition suspect and dangerous. The particular roles that academics come to play, it's really tricky. I don't know. So for instance, to take Sabar's portrayal of Karen King in the article and then the book that came out 2 years ago, I think a lot of us know Karen King and would not necessarily recognize her, but you would certainly recognize that character from these novels, right? So there's a way in which the portrayal of academic types follows almost necessarily certain requirements of the way we think about the Bible and history and the past and the ways it's being presented to us by them. How scholars could step into those roles is very interesting. That's something I'd have to think about. I think maybe, certainly, I think Smith was trying to portray himself as a kind of modern Bible hunter in some ways, like Tischendorf light, or Tischendorf awry, sort of ironic Tischendorf maybe, that he could go into a monastery and discover texts. But that didn't work, right? That's not how he ends up, that's not the Smith who ends up being part of the narrative. He gets routed and shaped in different directions, almost because this is what's required when we want to think about the personal brokers of biblical knowledge.
Thank you. And it is 1 past the hour, and I do not see any questions in the lineup, so I will wrap us up with just a warm thank you. This has been a wonderful session and really, really thought-provoking. And so thank you so much for sharing with us and answering all those questions. And thank you to everyone who asked such great questions.
Yes, thank you. This has been really wonderful. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, and with that, we wrap up our final Books Not Only by Title webinar with just, yeah, it's sad. But thank you to everyone who's been part of it. We are so grateful to all of you. Have a great evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are.
Thank you. Thank you very much.